So cities aren't typically associated with being green. I mean, there's concrete everywhere, garbage, traffic. There's a reason why New York is called the concrete jungle, where dreams are made of. Here's a map of carbon emissions per square mile for a typical American city. You can clearly see that downtown is hot red like a tomato. That means it produces way more pollution than the suburbs and the countryside. But measuring this using land area is not really fair because cities are a lot denser, so obviously it's going to produce more CO2. When you instead measure carbon emissions per household, the colors on this map completely flip around. All of a sudden, the city center produces the least amount of CO2. And this is the case with pretty much every American city. You'll notice a huge ring of red around the city center, and those are the suburbs, where households produce way more carbon emissions than people living in the city. And that's because American-style suburbia is designed in a way that forces people to live unsustainable lifestyles. So like any rich country, Americans love to drive cars, shop fast fashion, and buy creepy little demon dolls, otherwise known as labubus. But the US, Canada, and Australia for that matter have some of the highest CO2 emissions per capita compared to most other rich nations. A lot of this has to do with the reliance on fossil fuels, but city design is also important. The way your city is built determines how easy or hard it is to live a low-carbon lifestyle. When dense housing is available with easy access to green transportation options, people automatically live greener lifestyles by default. But unfortunately, most US cities consist of extremely low-density suburbs that consume tons of land and force people to drive polluting vehicles. Canada and Australia are not much better. Between 1950 and 1995, the land coverage of Chicago grew by 165%, despite the population only growing by 48%. And from 2001 to 2017, urban sprawl consumed nearly 14 million acres of natural land in the US, primarily from suburban residential developments. The construction of homes and the materials used for it produce a lot of carbon emissions, but suburbs are particularly bad because each home is larger and thus more materials and resources are needed for each household. In fact, the size of new homes in the US has increased by over 20% since the 1970s, despite the average household size decreasing. On the other hand, a denser neighborhood can get away with smaller homes because there's usually more public amenities like parks, libraries, and community centers. So when every home doesn't need 12 bedrooms and 56 private movie theaters, less construction and materials are needed for each household. Now, most energy used at home is for heating and cooling, but single-family detached homes are terrible at keeping heat in or out because all four sides of the home are exposed to the sun and wind. Compare this to a semi-detached home or an apartment where some of the walls are shared with their neighbors. But probably the biggest factor for the high carbon emissions in suburbs is the transportation that residents take. Is it easy to walk, cycle, and take transit, or are you completely dependent on a car? One study by the EPA comparing different housing types and their energy use showed that even the greenest house with the greenest car in the suburbs still has a higher carbon footprint than a regular house in a walkable neighborhood. Transportation makes up nearly 30% of all greenhouse gas emissions in the US, and more than half of that comes from cars. Commercial planes are also a big source, particularly domestic and short-haul flights, which are the most polluting form of transportation per passenger kilometer. All this could be avoided if people just had the option to walk or take the train, but you can't. Too bad, I guess. And aside from just tailpipe emissions, there's also noise pollution, dust particles that shed off of tires and brakes, and all the carbon emitted during the production of the vehicle, all of which will not be solved by electric cars. By the way, I have a previous video about electric cars, so go check that out. So driving a car itself leaves a high carbon footprint, but car dependency also worsens the environmental impact of your entire lifestyle. For example, people in suburbs tend to make less frequent and bulkier grocery trips where they buy several weeks worth of food all at the same time. And this leads to a lot of food waste, most of which is generated by households. Compare this to a more walkable city where it's normal and more convenient to make less frequent grocery trips where you buy less food at a time. This means you're eating fresher food more often, but more importantly, it makes it easier to only buy what you need. Now, a big reason why people like living in the suburbs is that it's closer to nature. But the sheer amount of space that suburbs consume actively destroys nature in the first place. Cities naturally protect the environment because of their density. The fact that so many people can live so close together means that more wilderness can be preserved. When you look at a satellite image, the suburbs might look very green compared to the city, but they actually have way more paved surface area per person. And this should be obvious because the suburbs are so spread out and car-centric that each suburbanite takes up more space with roads and parking lots than a person living in a denser city. And also, when I say dense, I'm not talking about Hong Kong or Manhattan. I don't know why, but when some people hear the word dense, their brain instantly jumps to the most overcrowded places on Earth. That way of thinking is very dense. Because in reality, cities can actually be relatively dense without feeling dense at all. I went to Amsterdam last year and I rented a bike at the city center, and I was able to cycle all the way to farmland in just half an hour. I mean, look, I even saw cows. And even the suburbs of Brooklyn, New York, which have single-family homes, still has way fewer paved surfaces per person than a modern car-centric suburb. Here's a map of the paved surface area per person around the world. You can clearly see that Canada and the US are among the highest. Yeah, even Canada, the country where everyone lives in igloos and rides their polar bear to work every day. Of course, this is not surprising when you consider just how many roads and parking lots are built here. In the US, there's an estimated 8 parking spaces for every single car. So, suburban sprawl consumes tons of land, destroying natural environments. Now, some random suburbanite might say, it's not my problem. But no, it actually is, because climate change is everyone's problem. There's a term called wildlife-urban interface, which is basically where Mother Nature goes, yo, you humans have built your homes a bit too far out, so I'm gonna ask you guys to back off. Wildfires have been getting more and more destructive due to climate change, which means more suburban neighborhoods are getting burned down. Obviously, this is very sad for the families who, lost their entire homes, but maybe we should not be building people's homes in a place prone to wildfires? Just maybe. And since suburbs are so car-centric, a lot of impervious surfaces are needed for roads, buildings, and parking lots, which do a terrible job at absorbing water compared to the forests and wetlands they replace. So as hurricanes and heavy rainfall become more common, again due to climate change, there's gonna be a lot more flooding in the city. A lot of cities still mostly use combined sewers, where rainwater that flows down the drain gets mixed with all the pee-pee and poo-poo. And so when there's a lot of rain, that can cause the sewage system to overflow, which means all that pee-pee and poo-poo water has to be dumped into lakes and rivers. Water that soaks into natural land will normally evaporate off the ground or vaporize into the air through plants. This is called evapotranspiration, which naturally cools down the environment. But this obviously doesn't work as well when soil and vegetation are replaced by pavement, which, once again, sucks at absorbing water. Well, I guess you could technically also say that it doesn't suck. Now, something that paved surfaces do suck a lot of is heat. Lighter surfaces reflect more sunlight than darker ones, and since most pavement is dark, they absorb and emit a lot more solar energy, which means more heat. Not to mention cars themselves also produce a lot of heat from the energy produced by their engines. And all this combined leads to the urban heat island effect, where urban areas feel several degrees hotter than the countryside. This means that cities are much more vulnerable to heat waves, which, once again, will get worse due to climate change. Now, even if all that wasn't the case, a lot of the greenery in the suburbs are just lawns, specifically turf grass. Now, I'm not saying that suburban lawns are bad, but what I am saying is that suburban lawns are really freaking terrible. They destroy biodiversity by replacing native plants with a homogeneous monoculture of grass. That sounds like colonialism. Oh wait, American lawns are literally rooted in European colonialism. Wow. And without diverse species of plants, insects like bees and butterflies can't survive. Now, I know some people are gonna be like, ew, I hate bugs, they're so gross. But like, without insects, you might as well say goodbye to birds, and frogs, and basically the entire food chain. Plants grow by absorbing carbon from the air, that's like the whole point of planting trees. So when you pave over all that natural vegetation, all the carbon stored in those plants get released back into the atmosphere. Now, lawns are better than pavement because at the very least it does absorb water and carbon, but the amount of carbon emitted to maintain this grass completely cancels that out. The most common species of grass used on American lawns is the Poa pratensis, otherwise known as the Kentucky bluegrass. But despite what the name says, this grass is not native to Kentucky, it's actually native to Europe. So in order to maintain this grass in North America, you need an absurd amount of gas, water, and chemicals. Gasoline lawnmowers alone make up 5% of all air pollution in the United States. Water used outdoors accounts for 30 to 60% of all household water use, and up to half of that is wasted due to wind, evaporation, and runoff into drains. American households also use 3 million tons of synthetic fertilizers and 70 million pounds of pesticides each year, most of which end up in waterways. So next time you go swimming in the lake, not only are you swimming in pee-pee and poo-poo water, but there's probably a bunch of pesticides as well. Now, I know I'm gonna get comments from people saying that some people just prefer their lawn this way, but there are some neighborhoods and cities where you can be fined or sent to jail if your lawn isn't considered attractive enough.
A very natural look. Butterflies, bees, and birds coming. It's not just some grass doing nothing.
But her village mayor sees it very differently.
When ugly is that overwhelming, you have to call it what it is. That front yard looks hideous.
And even if you're free to grow all the flowers and bushes you want, all the pesticides that your neighbors are using can still flow into your lawn and kill all your plants. And for what? Just so bored suburban dads can impress their neighbors by uplifting an outdated European aristocrat aesthetic? Yes. Now, people often think that reducing our carbon emissions will result in a lower quality of life, that everyone will have to live in slums and drink through paper straws for the rest of their life. But consider that every single year, millions of Americans flock to Disneyland, or Paris, or Disneyland in Paris. People love places like this not necessarily because they're better for the environment, but because they're just better places to live. Denser, mixed-use buildings have obvious environmental benefits, but they also provide corner stores and cafes within neighborhoods, which provide third places for the community and makes the neighborhood more walkable. Trees increase biodiversity and provide shade, which cools down the environment. But they also make a street more aesthetically pleasing, which matters a lot. Instead of your typical suburban lawn, we should be using native lawns, which use indigenous plants instead of invasive species. This means it doesn't need any additional water or chemicals to maintain because they're actually native to the area. Thankfully, some US states have started to encourage people to plant native gardens. And some states have also started to make it illegal to have a green lawn, especially those in desert climates. Also, everyone loves parks. Parks are some of the best public spaces within cities, but they can also help limit suburban sprawl in the first place. Countryside preserves like national parks, wetlands, and endangered species habitats can be used to prohibit development, and they can be connected together to form a larger green belt around the city. Car cities make life worse for everyone, including car drivers. When you have the option to walk, bike, or take transit, you don't have to waste your life sitting in soul-crushing traffic all day, and it's more environmentally friendly. Bike lanes make you healthier, but they also make the streets safer for everyone, and they move more people than a car lane. And a well-designed bike lane can actually use trees to further protect cyclists from cars. Isn't that great? We can save lives, improve traffic, and become healthier while also saving the planet. Wow! Trams are amazing as well because nothing can move this many people so efficiently while also making the environment better. When the street isn't taken up by 6 lanes of car traffic, there's actually a lot of space to add trees and other greenery. Here's a street in Amsterdam that only has grassy tram tracks and bicycle paths. As a result, this place is beautiful and doesn't feel busy at all, even though it probably moves more people than a street full of cars. The point here is that people don't place the environment as their #1 priority. People don't cycle just because it's eco-friendly, they cycle because it's healthier, cheaper, and doesn't get stuck in traffic. People don't spend time in parks just because trees absorb carbon dioxide, they spend time in parks because they're just nice places to be. 68% of the world's population will be living in cities by the year 2050, so it's really important that we make the right choice easier. Even though buying less creepy demon dolls would help the environment, we can also design cities so that people live sustainable lifestyles without even thinking about it. Now, most Americans associate public transit as a big city thing, but it's just as important for the suburbs. Historically, suburbs were built along commuter rail and streetcar lines, which allowed people to easily walk to a transit stop. And of course, this meant that these suburbs were walkable. Housing was denser, streets were narrower, and corner stores were built into the neighborhood. This is exactly how the old historic main streets were built across America, and it's how new suburbs can be built today, by creating new commuter rail lines that extend to the suburbs and building transit-oriented developments around stations. But if we want to create good regional transit like this, we need good regional planning. American cities might look very big and sprawling, which they are, but the legal boundaries of each city are actually very small. A single metro area can consist of a dozen separate municipalities, each with their own separate transit agencies that compete with each other for ridership and funding. So without coordination among all these cities, it's nearly impossible to create a seamless regional transit system. Instead, public transit becomes this mess of disconnected puzzle pieces that don't really integrate well with each other. And you could build a walkable neighborhood in the suburbs, but when it's not connected to public transit, people still need a car to visit anywhere else. Now, one example of a city that does things right is Paris. The city itself is pretty small and dense, but Paris is also closely integrated with the entire Île-de-France region. Their public transit system is already world-class, but they have plans to nearly double the entire metro system with the Grand Paris Express, a huge network of metro lines that will surround the entire city. Again, this would not be possible without coordination and planning on a regional scale. The socialist mayor Anne Hidalgo has made it a priority to push cars out of the city. They removed thousands of parking spaces, built hundreds of miles of bike lanes, and made more than 100 streets car-free. Paris has a reputation for being a dirty, stinky city, which, to be fair, it is. But as a result of all these changes, air pollution has decreased by over 50% since the early 2000s. So just as the suburbs were created with top-down planning from higher levels of government, fixing them requires the same thing. Thanks for watching today's video. As always, be sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon where I'll be posting exclusive content, and you get access to all my videos early and ad-free. Anyways, see you guys later.